I'll be talking about the basics of servlets, and these are the basic components out of which most modern web frameworks are built out of. All right. Okay, so let's give an overview. What is a servlet? So it's a web component used for generating dynamic web content. So one thing to note is that a servlet is not the same thing as a server. Have you guys ever had experience configuring servers? Used Apache or something like that? Okay, so I'm not actually going to talk about how to configure the servers. You guys are just going to have to figure that out on your own. So once you've gotten your server configured to run web apps or whatever, you can run servlets on them. And these are Java programs which the server itself will execute. And those programs will handle the generation of responses to requests that the client sends out. So yeah, as it says here, it's a middle layer between the request and the applications on the HTTP server. So I actually have a diagram here. So what happens here is that you and your browser will connect to the web server. You make a request to it. The web server delegates the request to a servlet, and then the servlet generates a response, which the server translates into something which the browser can read. So, okay. So what are the advantages of a servlet? There's an abundance of third-party tools. Servlets have been around for quite a long time already. So you'll find lots of libraries. Almost anything you want to do, you can find something there. You've got access to the entire family of Java APIs. If you guys have used Java, then you'll know what those are. You can also reload servlets automatically. That means that you won't have to restart the server itself. If you need to change something, you don't have to take down the whole site just to fix something. You just have to restart the servlet. They're also extensible and inexpensive. Extensibility meaning you can easily extend them to add more functionality. And what does a servlet do? This is what I said earlier. It receives a client request. It takes the information. It does something, I don't know, business logic or whatever you want it to do. Then it returns a response that the browser can read. It forwards the request to another servlet or JSP page. We won't actually be talking about JSPs today. So this is going to be pure servlets. Has anyone actually used servlets before? So anyone given it a try? No? None. Okay. Okay. So what are our request and response? A request is information sent from the client to the server. So yeah, it gives you a lot of information. We'll be talking more about that later on. But for now, all you need to know is that it tells you who made the request, what data is sent, what headers are sent, and the response is information sent from the server to the client. So the response would be the web pages that you see, images, and then also cookies and HTTP headers if you've seen those. I assume you guys know what cookies are. Cookies, referrers. So PHP actually has some features like that. So you might have run across them in your work. Okay, so let's take a look at beginning servlet code. So this is the most basic servlet you can have, and all it does is it prints out hello world. So I'll be explaining each part of this piece by piece. First we import a bunch of servlet packages. I'm going to assume you all know Java. I hope you guys can at least follow basic Java syntax. Is that fine? Yeah. Okay. So you import the packages which contain servlets. After which you extend HTTP servlet. This is what tells it that it's a servlet that you can run. And then we override a method. doGet is actually a method that's found in HTTP servlet, and we override it, and we tell it that this is what we want to do when a GET request is made on the server. And do you guys know what the difference between GET, POST, etc.? Yeah. Okay. So this is similar to whatever it is in PHP that you do to handle gets. You just make a doGet method, and then inside it you just tell it to do whatever. In this case, we're telling it that the response is going to be HTML, and then we just have to write whatever we want. We can write HTML, we can write some headers to the response, etc. So okay, let's look at this in action. 1 second. So this is just the code that you saw me project on screen. I just type it out. So let's run it on the server. In this case, I'm using Tomcat. but you can actually run it on different servers. You can use whatever server you feel like. So best practice, actually, although I returned HTML here, best practice is actually that you shouldn't be returning HTML from there. Why did I do it in the sample code? Because what you're really supposed to do, you're supposed to work in concert with JSPs, and JSPs are actually out of the scope of this, so I've just combined them in there. You'll want to read how to use JSPs with servlets later on. Okay, and yeah, it uses typically we have an MVC pattern. Are you guys familiar with the concept of MVC? Okay, for those of you who don't know, MVC means Model View Controller, which basically means we separate the responsibilities. We layer the app such that we separate our business knowledge from the way the application is presented from the back-end logic, which is where all the important stuff happens, like writing to databases, etc., doing computations, etc. So the servlet basically corresponds to the controller, and the JSP handles the view. And again, if you look up JSPs, you'll see more examples of how to do this. Okay, so servlet lifecycle. But before that, does anyone have any questions? Okay. Okay, so the servlet lifecycle, basically we've got a servlet container, and what happens is that someone makes an HTTP request, no and yes. I don't actually know what no and yes mean. Oh, okay, is servlet loaded? No, if the servlet is not loaded, it'll load the servlet up and then return a response. If it's already loaded, then it invokes the server, it runs the servlet, and returns the response. So pretty clear, I think. Any questions regarding that? Sorry? Okay. Okay, and how does it actually work inside the servlet? All I showed you was the do get and do post methods, but there's actually a couple more. A servlet actually comes to life with an init. If you guys know what a constructor is, it's similar to that. It's similar to the constructor for an object. The init basically does all the initialization. For instance, it sets up database connections, it loads up parameters that are provided during startup, etc. After which, you'll notice that there's a weird recycle looking thing here. What this actually means is that it'll call do get and do post. How does it know whether to call do get or do post? The service method actually figures that out for you. So there's already an existing service method, and in general you don't want to touch it. But what it does, you can if you want to, but you don't want to touch it. What it does, it figures out whether you want to use a get or a post. And once the servlet is shut down, it calls destroy, which is pretty much the opposite of init. So can anyone guess what you would do in a destroy method? Yeah, destruct. So what sort of stuff would you do in there in a destructor? What? What? So destroy the. Well, no, it doesn't. It doesn't actually destroy the request. Init and destroy are called not at the start of a request. They're called at the start of the life of the servlet itself. So that's an important distinction. The life of a request just lasts here in the orange arrows. The life of the servlet itself starts with one call to init and then ends with one call to destroy. In destroy, you would do stuff like free up database connections, close file streams, deallocate any memory which you might have allocated. Although in Java you actually don't need to do that since it's taken care of for you. Okay. Right, so this is all the stuff I just said. The container controls the life cycle of a servlet, and it dispatches init, service, and destroy. Yeah, so service is the one, again, that figures out whether you do get or do post. Okay, so you can override the init method, again, to do whatever you want. Initialize database connections. Okay, so you can also configure it with initial parameters. You can just use the method getInitParameter, which should give you the value of these parameters. How are these parameters set? These parameters are set via web.xml. Web.xml, you can configure. This is an XML file which the server container uses to initialize your servlets. So basically, when it initializes your servlet, it looks up these init params and it makes them available from runtime. it sees that driver and URL are initialized in that XML file, and when you use this, it will give you those values. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. Okay. So again, the service method allows the servlet to respond to a request. It determines whether to use do get, do post, etc., etc. Do not override this method. Actually, you can if you have a really good reason. If you can justify it, please go right ahead and override it. Do get, do post, take HTTP requests and responses. Yeah, okay. So, yeah, when you make a request, it goes to the server and goes through the service method, and then it calls either do get or do post. It just chooses that based on what was on the parameters of the request. Do you guys have any questions so far? No? Okay. So what sort of things do you do in do get and do post? You can extract information from the request. You can set and get attributes from scope objects. We'll be talking about what scope objects are later on. You can perform some business logic. You can also forward to other servlets or JSPs, and then populate HTTP response messages and send them to the client. So we've got samples of that, but first let's see. Okay. So here we've got an example of do get. This is a pretty complicated one. What it does is, actually, can anyone guess what? Among those of you who can read this small text, can you guess what it does? Let's see. So, okay. Any guesses? Oh. No one? Oh. Yeah?
It requests for the birthday of the person, then computes its age.
It computes their age, and it also greets them happy birthday. It takes them to a birthday page if it's their birthday today. Okay. Okay, so as you can see, the business logic is pretty much the same as the logic of any Java program you would have. So the only difference is that you've got requests and responses to deal with, and that's pretty much it. Otherwise, it's your basic Java program. So how do we populate the HTTP response? We fill the response headers. We set some properties of the response. We give it a buffer size. We get an output stream object from the response and write body content to the output stream. So what do these mean? Fill response headers. Do you guys know what response headers are? Okay, we'll be talking more about these a little bit later, but response headers are something that gives you information about how the server responded. So the most common response, which most sites that you visit will give you, is 200, which means okay. And other examples of headers may be response code like 404. I'm sure you guys have seen 404. Error 500. Those are things that you will find in the response headers. Other things, set the properties of the response. It's not just the response codes. There are other properties such as buffer size or type. Like it'll tell you what type of file, whether it's an image or an XML file or something. These are properties that well-written client will be able to access and do something smart with. Okay, get an output stream object from the response, which means that it will, in the Java code, you can get an output stream object. I hope you guys have worked with output streams before, and then you can write to it the same way you would write to a file or to a whatever, except instead of being written to a file, it's written over the network to the client who's viewing the page. Okay, so here's an example. We've got we're setting the content type to text/HTML, set buffer size, and then we're getting a response stream and then writing to it. I won't be showing you sample code for this because the only new stuff that we have here is not actually something that's going to be visible on screen. It's something that works in the underlying mechanism. I mentioned the destroy method. So again, it's called only once, and it's invoked before the servlet instance is removed. So it's So it's equivalent to a destructor if you guys have written in C++ before. This is where you deallocate resources such as database connections, etc. And yeah, you can override it to do whatever it is you think needs to be done. Okay, scope objects. Hang on. Okay. So scope objects. Anyone familiar with the concept of scope objects? Okay. So basically this maintains the attributes that allow you to share information between things. Because yeah, attributes can be accessed through get attribute and set attribute. Typically you won't be able to remember things from page to page. It's because HTTP has no concept of state. Every request is considered independent, so you need to come up with other ways to store information. So yeah, there are 4 scope objects. There's a web context, there's the session, the request, and the page. I won't be discussing all of them in detail, but I think it's the request that I will be discussing in detail. But I'll discuss them very briefly, the others very briefly. So web context is a scope, which means that it's accessible throughout the entire servlet. Okay, so if you set an attribute during one request, another request will be able to access that attribute via the web context. A session is slightly different. It's not really accessible by anything in the servlet. Rather, it's accessible by anyone who has the same session in the servlet. Okay, so sessions can actually be preserved through the notion of, for instance, cookies. That's the most common way of doing it. And you can read more about sessions later on. Okay, request, we'll be talking about that in a moment. Page, it's never really been clear to me what the scope of a page is. My understanding is that it's something that's accessible only within a JSP, but not within the do get and do post methods themselves. Okay, but I'm going to be discussing servlet request in detail here because it's probably the one that's most immediately important. So the servlet request contains data passed from the client to the servlet. All requests will implement servlet request. So you can get all these things: client set parameters, object valued attributes, locales, client and server, input stream protocol information, etc., etc. Now, what each of those means is out of the scope of this discussion. But yeah, the important thing is you know that this is how you access those things if you ever find that you need them. Servlet request is an extension of, HTTP servlet request is actually a subclass of servlet request, which means that it lets you do all the things that a servlet request does, but you can also access things that are exclusive to HTTP. For instance, HTTP request URL, meaning that you can get the URL that the person was trying to access. Were they trying to access www.yahoo.com/whatever? You can get that from there. Okay, miscellaneous request header information. So yeah, request headers can contain lots of things. For instance, like what file type is the client expecting, what page referred you to that servlet, etc., etc. Authentication type, user security information, and then again cookies and session. Any questions regarding this part? Okay. Okay, so an HTTP servlet request contains the data passed from the client to the servlet and always includes a specific HTTP method. I mentioned it earlier. HTTP allows you to do methods such as get and post. So if you use get, then it will call do get. If you use post, it will call do post. HTTP actually supports other verbs. There are other verbs like delete and put. I won't be discussing those here. Those are important if you want to do something that's RESTful. And RESTful stuff is, again, something that I won't be discussing. But if you want to read up on it, I really recommend you do because it's going to be quite important in the future, I think. Okay. So, getting information from the servlet. The request can have a lot of parameters, and you can access them using a get parameter name. Get parameter followed by the name of the parameter. You already saw an example of this in my sample code earlier. I was fetching the name and I was using it. Okay, returns null if the parameter was not specified. Okay. Yeah. If a parameter can have more than one values, it's also possible to access them. So you can just say get parameter values and it will return an array of values that were passed to it. Get parameter names will give you a list of all available parameters. So if you want to find out what all the parameters the client sent were, you can find it there. Okay, and the parameters are sent from HTML forms. How do you tell it whether to use a get method or a post method? From the side of the person who's doing the web development, the way you do it is you just call get. Is you just write a form with method equals get, method equals post. If you're actually formulating the request by hand, as in writing the HTTP request itself, you're actually going to have to set it somewhere in the header. I'm not entirely clear on that one, but for most of you, this is what you'll need to know. Just change the method to get or post, and it will access it in the way you want. Okay, so get versus post. So before I actually show that, can anyone guess when you would want to use get versus post, get over post, and vice versa? So you guys have done PHP, so I'm hoping you guys do know. Yeah. Okay. Any good use cases from anyone? When to use get over post? Yeah. No.
There's a minimal. When you're using, when you're passing password, you will just post so that when
Go on. Sige.
Yung pag i-ano mo yung password, kailangan post lang yung gamitin mo kasi pag get makikita sa URL.
Okay. Okay. That's a good example. So yeah, you would want to post a password because you don't want that information to be passed over get. But how about get? When would you want to use get instead of post? Anyone? Okay, so one good example for using get, and I'll just move on to the next slide, would be, for instance, if you want to be able to bookmark a page. It wouldn't make sense to post. For instance, if you were linking to an article on a website, the article would probably be fetched by a get request of some kind. You wouldn't want to use post because otherwise you'd just be at the all your bookmarks would go to the same page. But then if you make it a get request, then it will also bookmark the question mark article ID equals 1 or 2 or 3 or whatever. Okay, so yeah, and the other thing is that a post can be used to send any amount of data. So you can send really big chunks of information, opposed to a get where you can only send a really small subset of information. Okay, now. Please take note, though, that this isn't some kind of guarantee for security. Just because you're using post doesn't mean that your application is safe, because anyone can just write their own fake. Anyone can write their own fake form and then submit it with forged headers to a website, and it will be just as bad as get. The only difference is it's more inconvenient to abuse it. So that's just a quick aside there about security. So yes. Good question. I don't know. But in general, if you're sending a lot, for instance, if you're posting on a forum and you've got a really long message, those are things that you should really use. You should post rather than get. Because another disadvantage with using get is that it all gets encoded in the URL, and you might screw up the encoding or something, and you'll end up with really long URLs which you don't want. I realize that doesn't answer your question about what the limit is, but that's a general rule of thumb that you can use. In general, if it seems long, then just use a post. Okay. Okay. So yeah, another thing with get versus post is that the assumption with get is that nothing changes. So when you use a get, all you're doing is